Never. We're just going to give folks a couple more minutes to get settled in. I know we're already on the air. But, oh, see, that was to let you keep talking. That was my way of letting you continue talking. Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Welcome. And welcome to our speaker, Dr. Saeed Khan. He's over there. Thank you for joining us tonight. A couple of announcements. On Sunday from 12 to 3, we will have our day of service and celebration. We'll begin in here with a very nice lunch catered by Julie. That's free. If you're interested in being part of the lunch making for the NOAA program, please see Audrey. Raise your hand, Audrey. And Audrey will make sure you're on that list. And we've got people coming from a variety of organizations in town. There'll be different projects for children. We'll go to about 3 o'clock, and I think it'll be a really fun-filled afternoon. So please join us for that. Next week, we do not have a service. It's Memorial Day weekend, and I have discovered over the years that humanistic Jews are just not that into Shavuot. I can't imagine why. Maybe it's because the legend is about getting a Torah on Sinai. So that one may not fit quite so well with our beliefs. And there's the agricultural element, but we'll do that on Sunday because the gardening committee is going to be part of that. So, but we will be back on June 2nd and June 9th, where I will be replaced by Melanie Goldberg. She's not in the room right now, but she'll be, oh, there she is, over there, sorry. Hurts when I turn this way, so I try not to do that. But Melanie will be leading services those couple of weeks, then I'll be back the week after. All right, our readers tonight are Jean Clarich, Mary Monahan, Natan Fuchs, and Lonnie Fleischer, and Rabbi Miriam Jairus. But we are going to start first with the wonderful and incredible new-ish members of our congregation. Cindy and Bruce Hillenberg joined 2.5 years ago and dedicated the Oneg tonight, which you too can sponsor. They dedicate, not tonight's, they took that one already. But you too can sponsor an Oneg in honor of 2.5 years of happiness that our congregation has brought them, and that made me so happy to learn that. So thank you, and please come on up as we do this first reading, and then we'll light our Shabbat candles. Arthur? As these Shabbat candles that we are about to kindle give light to all who behold them, so may we by our lives give light to all who behold us. As their brightness reminds us of the generations who brought light, so may we in our own day be among those who bring light. Baruch haor ba'olam. Baruch haor ba'olam. Baruch haor ba'shalom. Ba'shalom. Baruch haor. Baruch haor. Ba'shalom.
There are times when we seek things for ourselves and measure failure by what we do not gain. When we gather on Shabbat, we seek not to acquire, but to share. There are times when we exploit nature as if it were a horn of plenty that can never be exhausted. When we gather on Shabbat, we consider our true place on this planet. There are times when we act as if we cared nothing for the rights of others. When we gather on Shabbat, we remind ourselves that justice is our duty and a better world our goal. Let us embrace this moment, a Shabbat gathering to unite, to learn, to better ourselves.
Shalom Aleichem, Ohavei HaShalom, Shomerei Shalom. Shalom Aleichem, Rodefei HaShalom, Shalom Aleichem. Boachem l'Shalom, Ohavei HaShalom, Zeichem l'Shalom. Biyom zeh yamin habayim, Shalom Aleichem. Shalom Aleichem, Ohavei HaShalom, Shomerei Shalom. Shalom Aleichem, Rodefei HaShalom, Shalom Aleichem.
I took over a reading from someone who wasn't here. Let us endeavor to find still moments, quiet spaces within, to refresh ourselves. Moments without ceaseless questions or inner debates, when we meditate only on goodness. Let us endeavor to nurture courage, recalling moments of strength. Let us remember days of fortitude and the power that we found. Let us endeavor to turn to light, to feel the warmth of a loving touch, our faces and fingers outstretched, alive to each other.
L'chuneranana, 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 la Shabbat. L'chuneranana, 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 la Shabbat. Nariya, nariya, leyom simchatenu, nekadma v'shalom. Nariya, nariya, leyom simchatenu, bizmirot nariya lo. L'chuneranana, 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 la Shabbat. L'chuneranana, 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 la Shabbat. Nariya, nariya, leyom simchatenu, nikadma v'shalom. Nariya, nariya, leyom simchatenu, bizmirot nariya lo.
Neil deGrasse Tyson wrote, "We are all connected to each other biologically, to the earth chemically, to the rest of the universe atomically. There's as many atoms in a single molecule of your DNA as there are stars in the typical galaxy. We are, each of us, a little universe." Carl Sagan put it this way, The cosmos is within us. We are made of star stuff. We are a way for the cosmos to know itself.
תקוותי, תקוותי בי, איפה כוחי, כוחי בי, וגם בך, וגם בך, איפה כוחי, כוחי בי, וגם בך, וגם בך. Where is my light? My light is in me. Where is my hope? My hope is in me. Where is my strength? My strength is in me. And in you, and in you. Where is my strength? My strength is in me. And in you, and in you.
Shabbat Shalom. Don't merely expect to find or to believe that life is worthwhile. Make it worthwhile. Don't merely see life whole, make it whole. Not knowing which should come first, to improve oneself or to improve the world, we end up doing neither. Actually, the only way to improve the world is by improving oneself. And the only way to improve oneself is by improving the world.
There's a place with answers we are seeking. There's a place to find our light of hope. Where's the strength to realize our vision? Yesh makom b'tochenu, yesh makom b'tochenu. Look within yourself, you'll find it there. There's a place with wisdom that can guide us. There's a place where we know what's right or wrong. Where's the path to peace that we all long for? Yesh makom b'tochenu, yesh makom b'tochenu. Look within yourself, you'll find it there.
Shabbat Shalom, y'all. When justice burns within us like a flaming fire, when love evokes willing sacrifice from us, when, to the last full measure of selfless devotion, we demonstrate our belief in the ultimate triumph of truth and righteousness, then goodness encompasses our lives, and we can begin to change the world.
Amar Rabbi Akiva, Amar Rabbi Akiva, Ve'ahavta l'reacha, l'reacha kamo gadol gadol batorah, Amar Rabbi Akiva. Amar Rabbi Akiva. Amar Rabbi Akiva. Ve'ahavta l'reacha, l'reacha kamocha. Zel klal gadol gadol batorah, Amar Rabbi Akiva.
Thank you, Lonnie. Judy Chicago's The Merger Poem. And then all that has divided us will merge. And when compassion will be wedded to power, and then softness will come to a world that is harsh and unkind. And then both men and women will be gentle. And then both women and men will be strong. And then no person will be subject to another's will. And then all will be rich and free and varied. And then the greed of some will give way to the needs of many. And then all will share equally in the earth's abundance. And then all will care for the sick and the weak and the old. And then all will nourish the young. And then all will cherish life's creatures. And then all will live in harmony with each other and the earth. And then everywhere will be called Eden once again.
Na'aseh shalom shalom ba'olam, Na'aseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol ha'olam ve'imru shalom. Na'aseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol ha'olam ve'imru shalom. Na'aseh shalom shalom ba'olam, Na'aseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol ha'olam ve'imru shalom.
In this community where we find strength and common purpose, we turn our minds and hearts toward all those who need our love and support, those who are ill, those who suffer pain of the body or spirit, those who are lonely, those who have been wronged. Tonight, our well wishes are extended to these members of our community and to their loved ones, to Ruthie Goldman, Ruth Maltz, Rabbi Peter Schweitzer, and Jim Walker. If there's someone whom you're thinking about who's ill or in need of support as we go around the room, starting on this side, Melanie. Julie Anderson. Thank you. Anybody on this side here? Over here, anybody? Miss anyone? May all who suffer know that they are not alone, that we are there. May they be healed quickly. May they experience a refuah shlema, a complete recovery, the renewal of their bodies and the renewal of their spirits.
Mekom ha'kolach betochenu, Mekorot ha'bracha me'emrotenu. May the source of strength that dwells so deep within us help us find the courage to make our lives a blessing, and let us say Shalom. מקום הכוח בתוכנו, מקורות הברכה מחברותינו. May those in need of healing know refuah shlema, the renewal of body, the renewal of spirit, and let us say, Shalom.
You can shed tears that they are gone, or you can smile because they have lived. You can close your eyes and pray that they will come back, or you can open your eyes and see all that they have left. Your heart can be empty because you can't see them, or you can be full of the love that you shared. You can turn your back on tomorrow and live yesterday, or you can be happy for tomorrow because of yesterday. You can remember them and only that they are gone, or you can cherish their memory and let it live on. You can cry and close your mind, be empty and turn your back. Or you can do what they would want. Smile, open your eyes, love, and go on. Our thoughts turn to those who are no longer with us, our own loved ones, those whom our friends and neighbors have lost, the martyrs of our people whose graves are unmarked, and those of every people and nation whose lives have been a blessing to humanity. As we remember them, we meditate on the meaning of love and loss, of life and death. We recall now our loved ones whom death has recently taken from us, those who died at this season in years past, and all those whom we have taken into our hearts with our own. As tonight we observe the yahrzeits of these members of our community and their loved ones, of Shirley Berman, Elsie Biederman, Eli Bricker, Sidney Broida, Harold Dennenberg, Anne Ellen Bogan, Ayala Fuchs, Edith Goldstone, Herbert Goldstone, Max Halpern, J. Maurice Caro, Tony Klarich, Ben Magder, Irving Ryder, Carl Stillwater, and Frida B. Williams. If there's someone whom you're thinking about tonight, who you'd like remembered. Thank you. Anybody? Yes, Esther. Sherry. Anybody else on this side, Miriam? And anybody over on this side? Did we miss anyone at all? We say Yehi Zichram Livracha, by which we mean, may, as we go through life in their absence, warm and beautiful memories of them and our time together provide us with a moment of comfort. If you can do so comfortably, please rise as together we recite our humanistic interpretation of Kaddish. Nit kadal v'nit kadash beruach ha'adam. Let us dignify and ennoble all people in the spirit of our shared humanity. Let us acclaim the preciousness of life. Let us show gratitude for life by approaching it with reverence. Let us embrace the whole world, even as we wrestle with its parts. Let us, each in our own way, take up our share in serving the world and seeking truth. May our commitment to life help us to strengthen healing of spirit and peace of mind. May justice and peace permeate and comfort the house of Israel and all those who dwell on earth. And let us say, Ken Yehi, may it be so. Please be seated. Well, indeed, we want to welcome Dr. Saeed Khan tonight. We are privileged to welcome one of the outstanding public intellectuals of our community. He is, as I'm sure all of you are aware, a highly respected and much appreciated voice of reason in our community. A scholar based at Wayne State University, where he teaches Islamic and Middle East Middle Eastern history. And I saw the list of classes. How do you even find time to do anything else? Amazing. He also teaches Islamic civilizations, the history of Islamic political thought, and other topics as well. He's lectured and taught at the University of Detroit Mercy, Rochester College, among other institutions of higher learning. He's been an active and important voice in advising and participating in interfaith dialogue projects that bring together members of the Jewish community and the Muslim community, including partnerships with the JCRC, AJC, with areas of focus ranging from US policy, globalization, Middle East and Islamic studies, all the way to genomics and bioethics. Dr. Khan has been a contributor to many media outlets, places like C-SPAN, NPR, Voice of America, the National Press Club, the BBC, the CBC, so many others, including his own show that he had at WDET. You don't host that anymore, right? You told me. Yeah. I loved it when you did it. I listened then. Among the many other organizations and governments whom he served as a consultant or research fellow in other significant roles are the U.S. Arab Economic Forum, the Center for the Study of Transatlantic Diasporas, which he founded, Wayne State University Center for the Study of Citizenship, the Detroit Center for Civil Discourse, and governments and agencies in the UK and the US and elsewhere. All of this and more comes alongside his generous availability to local institutions, where he is a highly sought-after speaker. Tonight, Dr. Khan will speak about culture warriors and scapegoats, making sense of America's social landscape. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Saeed Khan.
Way too generous.
The water is for you.
Oh, thank you. Way too generous as usual. Thank you, Rabbi Jeff. Shabbat Shalom, Shalom Aleichem. Thank you for spending your evening with me. I know you do this because the Lakers played last night. So I know I'm not competing with that basketball game, and kind of was hoping that the Lakers would win, but we don't have to talk about that. You can catch me, if you'd like, on Deadline Detroit's The Week That Was, which is a weekly news roundup show that I do with the co-founder, Alan Lengel. And between Alan and some of the guests that he brings on, I have exponentially grown my vocabulary of Yiddish. I always thought, if you'll pardon, is it okay if I won't use the word, that there's various grades of bad people. And I learned about that as well. I think it would be impertinent for me to say those in a temple. So you can catch me out. You can catch me outside. Yeah. After Shabbat's over, like tomorrow night. But in many ways, I think that my experience with the show encompasses what I'd like to talk about tonight, and that is looking at the idea of culture. Now, many of you, and I see so many friendly faces, so many familiar faces, and I'm really I thank you for that level of commitment that you have. I wish some of my students had that, but I won't bring that up. And you know that I have mentioned before that I was born in Pakistan. I grew up in England for the first 8 years of my life, and have spent the rest of my time here in the United States. Coming to New York City in 1975, where I know it will be hard for some of you to believe, there really weren't too many South Asians there. And going to PS 197 in Far Rockaway, I was mistaken for being a Puerto Rican with a posh British accent. And given the mean streets of New York, that meant that that accent lasted exactly 3 more weeks. And it was expunged from me. We moved to, and by the way, growing up in New York, I grew up culturally Jewish. As many of you can probably remember, back in the mid-'70s, Nabisco used lard very generously in its food items, which meant that there were several years that went by before I could enjoy that quintessential American biscuit, as we called it from England, but cookie here, the Oreo. But fear not, American ingenuity brought us the Hydrox cookie, which coincided with me losing my baby teeth for my adult teeth, because if it wasn't age, those cookies would do it for you. They were so hard. And I remember when two pivotal moments happened in my life. One was when Nabisco went vegetable shortening, and Jell-O got the all-important U in a circle. And I guess I can say this in a temple, that the cry went out in my house like it was the land of Goshen, that we now were liberated as far as what we could eat. Otherwise, my mom used to actually have relatives send Jell-O from Pakistan because it did not have pork gelatin in it. And it never properly set. So it was always a little bit on the gooey side. But the fact that I grew up culturally literate in understanding how to look for a K and a U with a circle, and the word parevi, meant something to me. It meant that you were the beneficiaries, you were inheriting a culture, a tradition, and a pathway that someone else had set for you. We moved to Houston, Texas, where in 1977, again, there weren't too many South Asians there. You go to Houston and Dallas now, and it's a bit different. And people thought that we were Hispanic, because again, what else would they think? And then in 1979, when I was 12 years old, for whatever reason and for whatever my dad might have been smoking, we moved to that buzzing metropolis of Lapeer in the Thumb. And people thought we were renegades from Dearborn. Some probably still do, even though my parents no longer live there. They now live in a true Arab enclave of Sterling Heights. So I guess you can go home again. But the idea of having that kind of cultural chameleonism, if you will, meant that there really weren't any kinds of hang-ups. Because every time I walked out my front door, I realized that the world was going to be different than it was inside my home. Different only if I made it different. I learned how to play American football, much to my parents' chagrin. I was a scrawny kid with glasses all the time, had half my teeth, the other half I'd lost to Hydrox cookies. And learn to adapt. I remember my father saying when we moved to New York, look, no one plays cricket here. And I said, what? How can that be? And true to form, at PS 197, you played kickball, which also confused me because you rolled a ball on the ground and then you kicked it. It didn't seem very advanced. I was told by my father to take up an American sport, and baseball seemed to be good enough. And he told me very clearly, he says, okay, you can support any team you want as long as it's the Mets. Because I'm not taking you to the Bronx. Remember, this was 1975 and it was New York. The Bronx was just simply, I'm afraid, off limits to him. My dad's knowledge of New York was completely shaped in the crucible of the movie Death Wish by Charles Bronson. So you can imagine then how he saw New York City. Well, what happened was, growing up in all of these different manifestations, it became clear to me that I was, and this is not a bad term, culturally mongrelized. When people would ask me, well, what do you eat at home? I'd say, well, I eat pizza and spaghetti. Don't you eat any curry? I said, yes, on curry night. You know, whatever's left over from Taco Tuesday and Prince Spaghetti night is curry night. And we had in our home a fairly broad and ecumenical musical repertoire. There was a presumption that my parents only listened to classical Indian Bollywood music. But I was very blessed to have a father who listened to Radio 1 on the BBC in England. And every weekend, of course, we watched Top of the Pops. So we were very much apprised at, and you can imagine in the 1970s, early on, it was an idyllic time. Early Elton John, early David Bowie, early Roxy Music, and occasionally you would see these acts come to the United Kingdom, and people were just absolutely agog by them. I remember the first time we heard Stevie Wonder doing Superstition on the Top of the Pops. We'd never seen anything like this. Of course, we still didn't understand why thousands of people would show up at Heathrow Airport at 2 o'clock in the morning to greet David Cassidy. You had Neil deGrasse Tyson, his quote up here, I think maybe he could answer such cosmic questions for us. But it was not just an idyllic time, it was a real time. It was understanding that within my home, and perhaps even maybe more broadly in society, culture was not seen as a barrier. And part of it was that no one made a proprietary case for culture. You had British culture, and you could go ahead and pick and choose back in the 1970s which one you wanted. If you wanted the music, that was fine. If you liked the shows, Monty Python, still not a favorite of my parents, but you could go ahead and enjoy it. You could even, if you wanted to be rebellious, tell your parents, Mom and Dad, I actually like British food. They wouldn't believe you back then, but it was possible. Of course, British food means a whole lot different now. Imagine telling people that even quintessential British food isn't really British. The fact that fish and chips was brought to the British Isles by the Jewish community. The fact that chicken tikka masala was brought by South Asians. And now any drunkard coming out of a pub will gladly embrace either one, no matter how racist he might be. That's Britain. Here in America, I think we have a bit of a different historical genealogy. We're all from somewhere else. All of us drank the Kool-Aid, some of us maybe even freebased it, of Schoolhouse Rock, telling us that we are all part of the great American melting pot. I remember watching that particular one after the I'm just a Bill and I'm only a Bill one. And growing up in England, America was that kind of mythical place. It was the place of Walt Disney. It was the place of McDonald's. It was the place of so much that the rest of the world didn't have. It was a beacon, and it has been for so many people. And now I think about Disney World being targeted by the governor of Florida. And you see then, how far we have come. I won't go ahead and put a value judgment on going down or going up. I'll leave that to you. But the idea that what I would have thought as one of those immutably innocuous institutions has come under siege. A couple of days ago, I was at the Huntington Woods Public Library with my colleague, Fred Pearson, and we were talking about the 20th anniversary of the Second Iraq War and how far we've come as a country. And I made the comment that traveling in so many places as I have, having been fortunate to live in different places, the one thing that strikes me about the United States is we are literally the only country that glorifies defeat. You go anywhere in the South and you see memorials and monuments and statues to somebody that lost. I remember the very first time I went to Stone Mountain in Georgia. Have anyone been? Anyone been to Stone Mountain? So some friends of ours in Atlanta said, hey, let's do something tonight. I'm like, okay, what do you want to do? They're like, well, you already went to the aquarium, you already went to Coca-Cola, you already went to CNN. And I'm like, well, we pretty much ran out of things to do in Atlanta. They said, oh no, wait, there's one more. We're going to Stone Mountain. And of course, I knew about Stone Mountain. It was the largest, stone relief, even bigger than Mount Rushmore. And they have an amphitheater there. And it was a typical August, humid Georgia evening. And it was packed. I guess everybody else had realized that there were only 3 other things to do in Atlanta as well, so they came here. And I was struck by the cultural experience of it all. I went to get something to drink from the soda machine, and I came back, and I'm standing in the back next to a guy who is about 6'5". And when they are showing this laser light display, there's all kinds of very patriotic music that's going, and they are very ecumenical. It's Northern patriotic and Southern patriotic. They started playing the Battle Hymn of the Republic. And the three generals, the Confederate generals, come to life. And it looks, thanks to the technology of laser lights, as though the horses upon which they're mounted are trotting. It's kind of cool. The guy next to me was singing every single word of the Battle Hymn of the Republic. And he was sobbing. And he was 6'5". And I'm sitting here. Has any of you seen the movie Animal House? Okay. So there's a scene where the guys go to a club, and Otis Day and the Knights are playing. And somebody comes up to Peter Riegert and says, "If I was you," and he says, "Leaving, what a good idea." I was Boone that night. It was a very, very strange thing. And this was in 2008. So as you can imagine, 7 years after 9/11. And it was an inflection point, because here's another detail that I didn't tell you about that trip. It was while we were there, and while I had gone to CNN to take the tour, that the announcement came down that John McCain, running for president, had chosen his running mate. So you can imagine then what the temperature in the room, what the temperature was in Atlanta and everywhere else. This was a turning point with, of course, eventually what was going to happen, the election of America's first African-American president. You probably also remember around this time, the second thing that I noticed about America, other than the fact that we very uniquely glorify defeat. We also tend to declare wars against abstract things. Many of you remember, of course, the war on drugs that we had in the 1980s. Just Say No. Even Nancy Reagan got in on the act, sitting on the lap of Mr. T. There's some things I can't unthink, but that was one. 1979 was also, I remember watching Geraldo Rivera and talking about the war on heroin, so another kind of drug, the war against terrorism, GWAT, the global war on terrorism. I think maybe the only one that I might have agreed with was in 1979 when Steve Dahl declared war against disco at Comiskey Park in Chicago, where he invited people to bring disco records, and then they blew them up in the middle of Comiskey Park in the middle of a doubleheader. Who were the White Sox playing? They were playing the Tigers, absolutely. So watching it here, it was my first summer in Michigan, and remembering hearing George Kell and Al Kaline trying to make sense of what was going on. But some of you probably had a 101 FM WRIF dread card, which were given if you proudly wore your aversion to disco, which I've changed, I've matured, and I actually, guilty pleasure, like some disco now. It's coming back, I think. I just hope the clothes don't. But it seemed to me rather strange that in other parts of the world, places I've studied, places I've visited, places I've lived, we didn't have that idea of declaring war against these kinds of abstracts. But then when people like Bill O'Reilly and others declared war on culture, I got it. Especially when he says that there has been a war declared against Christmas. And this became a mantra that those people, and you can fill in the blank as you like, because I think he left it purposely ambiguous, we're now declaring war on Christmas. Why? Because you can no longer presume that the person to whom you greet with the words Merry Christmas will be okay with it. Now, how many of you have been mistakenly greeted with a Merry Christmas? No? Yes? Never? Of course, of course. And I'm sure none of you became culture war jihadists. If you did, you owe me a commission because that's kind of our, no, okay. Growing up, it was never an issue. Growing up in England, which is actually far more officially Christian, Church of England actually supervises public schools, never a problem. It was never a problem when they had, as they did every year, the school play. Never got to play Jesus. Never got to play Mary. Always was a wise king. And I was very cynical about it. I thought, oh man, they're really patronizing me by making me the wise king as though it's a cop-out. I'm not one of the main actors, you know, who's in the manger. You kind of show up there late. But then I decided to own it. And every time the teacher would say, okay, you get to be a wise king, I said, okay, as long as I'm myrrh. You know, I didn't have an agent, but I was pretty emphatic. I said, no gold, no frankincense, I will be myrrh. Stand your ground. Even in a small town like Lapeer, growing up in the early part of the 1980s with the recession, it never seemed as though it was a problem. I never recall my dad, who was a country doctor, ever being offended if somebody came up to us and say, Merry Christmas, and it was always something to return. If we knew somebody happened to not be Christian, we would go ahead and have the cultural literacy to go ahead and respond in what we felt was their area of comfort and receptivity. Happy holidays seemed perfectly fine with that. The one thing, of course, that the Muslims didn't really have to worry about when I was growing up at that time was that Ramadan never seemed to come at the same time as Christmas and Hanukkah. So they couldn't go ahead and shoehorn us into that mess. But that's what I mean. It was never messy. And I always wondered, A, when did this become problematic? And when did it move from being seen as a nuisance to an existential threat? That people all of a sudden thought that, and I'll borrow from Ghostbusters, what's next, dogs and cats living together and all. It was very, very strange to me. Understanding constitutional law, having read the cases dealing with the Allegheny County ACLU against the city of Pittsburgh, I learned about the case that dealt with the creche and the menorah and how the Supreme Court actually had a beautifully elegant decision, says no one now ever, on parsing the difference between the creche and the menorah, saying that the creche was unconstitutional because it was inside the city hall and it was seen as an unreasonable encroachment, whereas the menorah, being on the outside, did not have a completely theological element to it and was, bless you, and was far more secular. That seemed to make sense back in law school. Now, was that the opening salvo of people saying that there is now a culture war? Or was there something a little bit more nefarious going on? Was it saying that perhaps when we talk about culture, we're talking about a very exclusive culture, and a culture that is not willing to share space, and a culture that is not willing to yield even something as humane, as charitable, as hospitable, as saying, maybe you're not someone who observes Christmas, and that's okay, and we'll come up with something a little bit more inclusive. It was a very educational moment for me to see how the country and how the culture was now starting to shift. And I'm sure many of you probably felt the same way as this was happening. And it seems as though there's really only two explanations that inform how we are in a culture war. One, we could argue, is consumerism. The whole idea that people will make a presumption that we can make some kind of money and some kind of profit by making a false war. Because, of course, America never engages in or enters into wars that are mistakes or unjustified. But the idea that here now we had a new battleground in the United States and that we were actually going to pit people against one another, and worse, trying to manufacture fear and anxiety and intolerance to say you are under threat for something that doesn't exist. Star Wars actually got it right in one of the movies. The movie itself wasn't very good, but the title was A Phantom Menace. The very idea that there is something nefarious out there, there is a certain group that's out there. And I think certainly we see with the Jewish community a couple of millennia of having to deal with this scapegoating, with the idea of being seen as something nefarious, something other. When I teach my students about the Crusades, I always have to remind them that the Crusades were not these heraldic events that you think about typecasting people in their chivalrous outfits. I said, first of all, let me tell you something about classism. The only people who had chainmail are the people who could afford it. And the same people who could afford chainmail then are the ones who could shop on Rodeo Drive today, which means not me. This was very expensive stuff. It was also expensive to own a horse, which meant that most of the people who went in the Crusades, pretty much if they wanted to look like they were crusaders, got their burlap sack tunic that they had and put some sheep's blood to make a cross. If they were lucky, they had one pair of sandals, and they probably wouldn't have them by the time they reached the Holy Land because they had worn them out. And they certainly were going to have to walk because they couldn't afford a horse. But I always ask the question that how do you get a bunch of peasants who are working the fields, who probably their only kill count is a goat or a sheep, how do you get them into warrior mode? Well, the simple answer is you scapegoat people along the way. And unfortunately, the easiest target practice as they went eastward through Europe were Jewish communities. Blood libels start to fester in places like Norwich and elsewhere within Europe, and it becomes oh so easy in order to then go ahead and effectuate someone else's objective. And what was the objective here of the Crusades? It was cultural. You can talk about it in terms of theology, you can talk about it in terms of land, but it was creating a culture of hatred. Some of my students asked me the question today that is the culture of the Crusades still around? I said, well, when American presidents talk about a crusade in Iraq in 2001, you have to wonder if they're just still reading off a very old script. It does seem as though in some cases it is unfortunately embedded. But along with consumerism, there's another reason why we find the culture wars today here in the United States. Stanley Cohen wrote a book, which I strongly recommend, called Folk Devils and Moral Panics. And how many of you have heard of the book? You have. I knew you would have heard of the book. How many of you have heard of the term moral panic? Okay. The moral panic is essentially when society, even if it is unjustified to do so, gets agitated, gets worried, gets concerned, gets fearful about something. These anxieties become a collective. Sometimes they can start by one person or a few people, and then it has a mushroom effect. We're living in a time right now that even if there weren't people with their hands on the levers trying to exploit this, foment it, whether it's on certain cable networks or elsewhere, America's going through a moment in its history that's unprecedented, and perhaps even worse, is not being assessed with the kind of calm, cool reasoning. I had to slip in some Mike Brady Bunch talk there, for those of you who remember the bully episode of Buddy Hinton. I loved the Brady Bunch growing up. Really did. But the idea of where is America in itself? I saw Rabbi Akiva's wonderful quote from Leviticus 19:18 that love your neighbor like you do yourself. And I think sometimes people assume that when people hate someone else, it's just a pure hate. But I thought about that when you showed it, and perhaps the reason why people don't love their neighbor like themselves is because they don't love themselves. That perhaps it's really coming from the core itself. And it's a bit difficult to really love yourself if you're caught up in a lot of moral panics. So let's go through some of those compared to how things were maybe in a more idyllic pre-Nabisco vegetable shortening era. In 1991, America thought it had won. It had won everything. Francis Fukuyama wrote a book called The End of History and the Last Man, in which he was riffing off Hegel, with his famous dialectic, saying, well, now we're done. Western liberal democracy has prevailed, the Soviet Empire is done, and we will move toward, whether you're a Gary Cooper fan, into the sunset or into 1,000 years of peace ahead of us. And there would be no challenge. I don't think things really worked out quite as Hegel or Fukuyama had said. Fukuyama had the good sense of saying, yeah, I was kind of wrong, after his book got pilloried. But the very idea that America somehow, and what it stood for, and what the West represented, was now going to be a model that the rest of the world was going to follow, and if it was not, we were going to, and I'll use the word euphemistically, or nudge it into that direction, did not carry out over the last 30 years. In fact, if anything, now what we see in the news is a far more multipolar world. We see a world where American influence, whether you agree with it or not, has certainly declined. Some of the recent news items include, for example, French President Emmanuel Macron visiting Beijing, meeting with Premier Xi Jinping, and when asked about Taiwan, Macron said, yeah, I think that's your problem. France doesn't really have any issue with that. That was somewhat of a slap to the face of President Biden and the United States in general, that was really looking to provide support for this island democracy in the South China Sea. We also have, of course, a new broker of diplomacy in the Middle East, China, having created a détente between Iran and a fairly stalwart, until recently, American ally, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The fact that China now also has, and I feel free to use this word here, the chutzpah to say, Israel, Palestine, you're next if you want it. Russia, Ukraine, you're next. The idea that the United States no longer holds court, even among some of its strongest allies in the Middle East, is something that I never thought, as somebody who studies the Middle East, would see within my lifetime. And even if I did think that there was going to be peace, I think there was always that presumption that America would be in the room. We remember, of course, the incredibly awkward six-handed handshake between Carter, Begin, and Sadat. And I look at those pictures, I'm like, what are you doing in the Rose Garden? We've come a long way in 46 years, 44 years since that happened. The idea then that Russia, in an unprecedented way, is also in the Middle East. At one time, it was always lurking around. It was supplying arms to countries like Egypt and Syria and Iraq, but it never had an air base in the Middle East. It never had a naval base in the Middle East. Now it has one of each in Syria. There has been this withdrawal of American influence, the American footprint, and it seems as though people are now starting to pivot, looking elsewhere, at least to a world that in their minds might be more balanced, might have more proportionality. People talk about the next century or this century as being the century of Asia. I think it's still an open question, but I do know that things are a lot different than they were 30 years ago. We find that militarily, the United States, yes, still has a defense budget which is larger than the next 12 military budgets combined. 11 of those countries being allies of the United States. But the idea that our military is not able to necessarily solve issues also creates a sense of consternation for Americans. I think there is no more profound example of this than the fact that the most powerful army in the world could not stop 19 people from getting into 4 or 5 commercial jets and wreaking havoc 22 years ago. That's a rather sobering idea as well. And then we find in America that, of course, is changing demographically. In the 2010 census that was taken in the United States, for the first time in American history, the number of non-Hispanic white births was eclipsed by non-white births. For those who were keeping track, they were seeing that the ethnic change in this country was moving away from what was perceived to be the essential, or I should say the quintessential as well, American identity. White, Anglo-Saxon, I'm not a cheerleader, I never knew how to do that. I was never even good at doing the YMCA. I remember when I learned that the YMCA stood for the Young Men's Christian Organization. I'm like, wow, it's kind of limiting. Well, they still let me use the pool. But the idea that the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant identity, which had really come to be synonymous with America, which had actually become, in many ways, the goal for so many immigrant groups in this country, was now starting to shift. Some of you are familiar with the sociologist Milton Gordon, who had 3 different phases of assimilation models. The first one being Anglo-conformity. Those who came to the American shores, particularly in the 19th century and early 20th century, saw the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant model as being the paradigm that they wanted to achieve. Whether that was the wife, kids, dog, picket fence, suburb. We don't have a dog, we don't have a picket fence. Other stuff, yeah, okay. But this was seen as a goal for so many people. Now, some, of course, found out the hard way that the goal was not attainable to them. Think about the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Think about how many groups came from Southeastern Europe, from Slavic lands, from the Balkans. For them, they weren't white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. They weren't even considered white. The Irish, at a certain point in this country, were not considered white. If you read Noel Ignaciev's great book, How the Irish Became White, you see how this was a process that a former mentor of mine, the late Dr. Suleiman Niang, called the process of lactification. The fact of how people then in America become white. Before the relaxation of immigration quotas in 1965, it meant that the pool of immigrants that were coming were by and large from Europe. Thanks in large part to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, it meant that I wasn't going to get into the country, and a lot of people from Asia as well as Africa were similarly going to be disenfranchised. But those that did come, Italians, Jews, Poles, Irish, they then had a choice. Do you try to then maintain your own ethnic integrity, or do you then strive to live and attain the American dream? Well, something happens then, especially after World War I, when you see so many non-WASPs fighting. There was a process of reorientation. After all, World War I was also a catalyst for, the following year, 1920, the passage of the 19th Amendment, allowing women to finally have the right to vote. So these kinds of social changes as they occur also were adapting to demographic realities. And moving from Anglo-conformity, we now are in the midst of the melting pot, where you can come to the United States, you all melt in, and you leave what you once were and form something new, something different. For those of you who are chemistry majors in the past, or if you didn't like chemistry, sorry, you know the difference between a physical change and a chemical change. If you have a physical change, it means that you just bring in salt and sugar, and although it'll probably taste a little bit weird, the properties of the salt and the sugar remain the same. You go ahead and you add heat to it, chemical reaction, and you've got a new compound, something else. I don't even know what that is. Maybe it's sea salt caramel. But this then provided for hope for those who could not reach the Anglo-conformity model to now still be participants and stakeholders in the American dream. Why? Because the dream was allowed to be redefined. Nathan Glazer from Harvard and the former New York Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan then in the 1960s said, well, maybe we need to consider a different demographic model, particularly after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. With new demographic realities coming to the United States, they said, well, you really shouldn't have to give up everything. And so we're going to move into a mixed salad approach, or what we would call multiculturalism. And so here you have more of your hyphenated identities within the United States. You can still retain something of what you once were. You can still have it in the present tense. Well, that seemed to be fine. It seemed to be working until the very nature of demographics started to change. And as I said before, in 2010, you had this realization that what was seen as that fixed point of reference for many in this country was not going to be so. You do know that the North Star is moving, right? Or the North Star might be there, but the Earth is reorienting, and we may have a new star that we call the North Star. So you got that. And then, of course, the magnetic fields are also changing. But maybe we can have a lecture on science some other time. Or if you bring Neil deGrasse Tyson, I'll be here. In 2013, the Pew Center for the Study of Religious Life issued a report saying that for the first time in American history, Protestant Christianity was no longer the majority religion. It was at best a plurality. 30% of the American population was now Catholic. Another 30% were nuns, not Catholic nuns, N-O-N-E-S, meaning no affiliation. Meaning that for the first time, it was a Protestants were a non-majority. And so if you then see the WASP, 2010 census said that white is now being replaced with a browner population. The Anglo-Saxon part, the A and the S, are becoming more Latin American. And the P is being replaced by a C or an N. Now for some, that's a shrug of the shoulders, saying, America's changing, we're moving into a different paradigm. For others, that's the existential threat. That is the moral panic. How many of you have seen the movie Gangs of New York? All right. You remember there's the scene near the end, and for those of you who haven't seen it, I'm sorry for blowing the plot by mentioning the end, but all movies end. Bill the Butcher, played by the always excellent Daniel Day-Lewis, says, everything is changing. And of course, that movie was set during the Civil War in the Five Corners of Lower Manhattan in the era of the 1860s, which America was going through a similar moral panic of an influx of immigrants back then, many of whom were not Protestant. Well, if that's the case then, here's another statistic. The year 2040. Some of you are probably familiar with, in artificial intelligence, a man by the name of Ray Kurzweil. And Ray Kurzweil has said that in the year 2045, the world will reach what's called a technological singularity, meaning that here's human intelligence, and I'm being charitable today, artificial intelligence is rising at a level that by 2045, Kurzweil believes artificial intelligence will reach human intelligence and that from that point will surpass it. Okay? It may happen earlier, depending on what cable network you watch for your news. But there's another singularity that's happening in the United States, and that is a demographic singularity. Many demographers are speculating that by the year 2040, the non-white Anglo-Saxon Protestant population will match that of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant population, and then from that point on, that will exceed the WASP, meaning that America will become a majority-minority country. Again, there are plenty of people who not only anticipate this, look forward to it, will celebrate it as being the definition of a redefined America. They will not see it as a threat. They will see it as either an affirmation of their identity, maybe the final segment of that arc that had been created by Schoolhouse Rock. The very idea that we as America are unique in the world as being a country defined as a land of immigrants, as opposed to the post-Westphalian model of a single dominant race, ethnicity, religion, language, family, whatever it might be, as is the case with much of Europe today. That moral panic of the uncertainty of what America will quote unquote look like, but what will it feel like, explains the culture wars of today. And anyone and any group that is seen as vying for equal space, equal rights, is seen as a threat to what is already, for some people, a weak, vulnerable, eroding essential identity. And you see this playing out on matters of gender. You see this playing out on matters of sexual identity and orientation. You see this playing out in the debates about immigration. You see this playing out in the debates about race. It is everywhere. Now, back in around 2010, there was quite a bit of, let's call it, attention on the Muslim American community. In large part, it had to do with efforts to open up a community center near the site of the World Trade Center. The so-called Park 51, or the Twin Tower Mosque, or whatever they were calling it back then. This was, of course, knee-deep in the lead up to the midterm elections. People already seem to have a problem with Obama, and so let's go ahead and make him Muslim, and let's make him Kenyan, and therefore we can complete the package. And I remember it was also around the time when Reverend Terry Jones, no relation to the Monty Python guy, wanted to come up to Dearborn and burn a few Qurans in front of the Islamic Center of America. And it occurred to me that this Islamophobia was not exclusive, it was not unique, it was located within these bigger debates. And I decided to embark on what these were. You know, put on my trench coat, did my best Columbo, and moved forward on it. And I saw that people were distracted. If you were looking at politicians, with really few exceptions, there wasn't anything happening at the federal level. There was an awful lot happening at the state level. 38 different states were trying to ban Sharia law. And I contacted as many people as I could in this Muslim-deprived state of Michigan and said, anybody trying to propose anything regarding Sharia? And I mean, I know people, a few people. I said no. No one was even trying to get Eid declared as or recognized as an official holiday in public schools. Nothing. No one was trying to put a star and crescent on the state capitol, you know, because of course, gotta have room with the creche and the menorah and the Baphomet statue and everything else that's over there, and the Pastafarian colander. No, not looking to do that either. So here again, we find a phantom menace. It was about exploiting a scapegoat. And what was interesting about it is that it was happening right around the time of the end of the Iraq War, and when things were really going badly in Iraq. And if you remember, this was a time when American contractors and others were deeply fearful that people were going to start suing them here in the United States. And one of the big bugaboos that was happening, yes, that is an actual academic term, was that tort law was not going to keep them safe. And there was a flurry of activity to try to protect American interests from civil and criminal liability. And one of the ways to do that was to say that American law is paramount to international law being considered. Well, there's a problem with that, because if America is a signatory to any treaty and the treaty is ratified by the Senate, then that is a form of American law or international law to which we have to be upheld. But all you have to do is come up with supposedly the ultimate international law, Sharia law, and make efforts to try to ban that. So I said, I see what you're doing. You're going to go ahead and try to get international law out of consideration of state courts. Let's go ahead and start with Sharia law. I also looked at efforts to disenfranchise voters. I looked at the laws back then of anti-immigration efforts that were being made. I looked at laws that were limiting reproductive rights. Of course, this was before last year's Dobbs case at the Supreme Court. I also decided to look, because I am a proud Michigander, laws that were restricting union activity, as was happening in Wisconsin, and then unfortunately even here, the birthplace of unions. And lo and behold, what I found was that the same group of politicians in each of these states was responsible for sponsoring or co-sponsoring all of this legislation, in fact, to a level of 80%. If I looked at the people who were sponsoring anti-Sharia legislation, you bet they were responsible for sponsoring or co-sponsoring legislation which limited voter access or immigration or union activity, or reproductive rights access, or any of these other things, or also, prior to 2015, of course, same-sex marriage, LGBTQ rights. In some cases, they decided to get really lazy. North Carolina decided that they were going to sponsor a bill that banned Sharia law from any consideration by state court judges. They knew that no one was going to challenge this. There was going to be no public hue and cry about it, because, you know, Muslims are like droids. No one cares. I mean, you upset a Wookiee, they can rip your arms out, but droids are pretty docile. You have to really be into Star Wars for this. Well, what the legislators who were proposing this bill did is, at the very 11th hour, the night before it was going to be voted on by the legislature in Raleigh, they attached a rider. And in the rider, it limited reproductive rights in North Carolina. They knew that if they led with that, there was going to be Planned Parenthood, there was going to be the National Organization of Women, there was going to be a lot of pushback. And I said, wow, you basically proved my point. Thank you very much for the report that I was going to write. And I saw then the cosmology of the culture wars writ large. That here we have a bunch of people who are scared. They're uncertain about the world that's going to be in their future, and maybe that of their kids and their kids' kids. They're worried about an America looking and feeling different than what it is. And I promise you that the day after that turn happens, whether it's in 2040 or even before, people are not going to even know it happened. It's kind of like when the 200 millionth person went through McDonald's, apart from the fact that they made a big deal out of it, no one would have known. But it's all about perception. It's all about the idea that somehow the other, not only am I going to be less than what I am now, not only am I going to have fewer rights than I have now, but it's a zero-sum gain, and somebody else is going to be gaining that at my expense. Because after all, in a war, whether it's a culture war or a thumb war or any other kind of war, you have to have a winner and a loser. Now, how we get out of that misperception, I don't know. Except to understand that those people who are not part of that majority need to understand how that group feels about everybody and everything else. And at the same time recognizing that even within that group, there is not unanimity in feeling threatened about this issue. As America moves toward its future, and as we all as Americans move in that same direction in that future, I think that there is still an awful lot that can be done in order to allay the kinds of fears, to reduce the prospect of people being scapegoated, and to then try to find a way where, maybe not in such a mythical and idyllic way, but an America where people can, in fact, work together and coexist. I'm certainly much more optimistic about that than the ability for us as a planet to reduce the temperature by 1.5 Celsius within the next 10 years. That is a discussion of an entirely different time. But I see that these are the issues which, as we move closer to that demographic singularity, and I can't believe that that's happening around the time that we're hitting a technological singularity, that there is going to be these kinds of tensions, and we're going to become susceptible to how this is framed within the broader discourse about the culture wars. But we don't have to accept it. We never have to go ahead and accept the rhetoric of saying that we must be opponents to one another when it comes to this. And in fact, if anything, I have found that the culture wars have provided for what seemingly were improbable nodes of alliance and cooperation and collaboration with people. I think certainly, as you said, Rabbi, the kind of interfaith and intercultural engagement that we find now is something I could not have imagined in certainly the very dark period right after 9/11. The fact that I can actually go through TSA relatively unmolested is a bit odd. I came back from Azerbaijan in March, and I asked the TSA agent, because he said, where are you coming back from? I said, Baku. He said, how is it there? I said, oh, it's actually kind of nice. And he says, all right, welcome back home. I said, that's it? And he said, do you want something more? And I said, no, look, I'm just kind of curious, because sometimes I've come through and things haven't been as nice. And he says, give me your passport again. I said, oh man, I opened up my mouth. He says, oh yeah, we already got you. And I said, what? He says, yeah. We got your name 2 years ago in Afghanistan. So yeah, we're not looking for you anymore. I said, beautiful. Yeah. Still not my best one. I was coming back through New York once and got a special treatment, shall we say. And the guy's badge said Kylo Ren. Yeah, you can't make this stuff up. And I said, I got to ask you, man. I said, did anyone ever make fun of razz you about your name? And then he looked at my passport. He says, yeah, but not nearly as much as you. I said, touche for that. One of the things that I do find, and I think I'll end on this personal note, that I remember the years after 9/11, obviously. I mean, some of them were quite painful to see what was happening. and particularly what was happening to this country. And I always knew that it wouldn't last forever. What I did know, though, that somebody else, unfortunately, would be right behind us, another group that would be, unfortunately, and potentially scapegoated. And I would always tell and challenge my Muslim audiences, I said, okay, you've got a choice right now to decide that when you make it through that door, do you hold the door open for someone else? Or because you now feel that you can gloat that you got in, that you slammed the door behind? And I think that as we go through and as we find a way to deal with these culture wars, that is incumbent upon each and every one of us to decide, can we hold the door open, or now that we've gotten in, do we just say, you're on your own? Thank you. And by the way, I mean, thank you. I'm always inspired to be here, and some of you know from SOAR, by two people. You've got an amazing rabbi, and you also have had an amazing rabbi. Rabbi Sherwin-Wein was somebody who I met shortly after 9/11, actually at a talk at the Rochester Hills Public Library. And I'm like, yeah, I got to go back and work on my A game. So, thank you.
Thank you so very much. Thank you. I'm sorry. Well, I think that any day of the week you guys would trade the question time for extra time to hear him speak. But I hope you'll stay maybe a little bit for our Oneg Shabbat, and we can discuss things informally. And Arthur, if you will, to the next slide. And if you don't have it, it's really an easy song. Nope. All right, we're going to sing May We Know Peace. I don't know what happened to the slideshow. We may have had a little... Oh, there it is. Yeah.
May we know peace as we go on our way. May we be guided by love. May we be blessed with health and joy. May this be our blessing. Shalom. 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 May this be our blessing. Shalom. 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 May this be our blessing. Shalom. May we be sheltered by the wings of peace. May we abide in safety and in love. May grace and compassion find their way to everyone. May this be our blessing. Shalom. 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 May this be our blessing. Shalom. 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 May this be our blessing. Shalom.
Thank you again to Joseph for the beautiful music, to David who does our streaming. Thank you, Arthur, for the slides, and of course to Dr. Khan for your inspiring words. Please join us for the Oneg Shabbat, sponsored by the Hillenburg. Shabbat Shalom, everyone.